Welcome back to episode 38 of More Than Words, the show that crossed the 2,000 kilometre mark somewhere between a mojito and a spreadsheet update and only noticed a stage later. This week, the only monastery Henry VIII never managed to close because Norfolk solved the Reformation with a loophole and a boat trip, a 14th century manuscript which includes margin doodles of geese imitating ducks, and a spider that walks on water, hunts on water, and has the general energy of a creature that knows full well it doesn't need to be reasonable. Expect a sandbank that became medieval Europe's herring capital, a philosopher who died trying to refrigerate a chicken in a snowdrift, and a church whose clock has 3 faces. The 4th deliberately left blank because even in the 15th century Suffolk couldn't quite bring itself to give Norfolk the time of day. Think accidental national parks meets Bronze Age courtroom drama meets cattle being revived with a brandy after a flood. Narrated by someone who's just spent 3 days in Sharm visiting mosques and a magnificent Coptic cathedral before being comprehensively ignored by everyone at the airport with a uniform and apparently a grievance. This is episode 38. The Sandbank Redemption. On with the numbers then, so the total distance covered so far is 2,109 kilometres, 73.13% of the full route, and past the 3/4 mark if you round generously, which I do. The 2,000 kilometre milestone for some reason slipped past unannounced during the last stage, even though the spreadsheet had presumably been flashing numbers at me like an over-enthusiastic microwave. It has since been acknowledged. We have moved on. The time taken in real life was from the 16th to the 22nd of March 2026, and my current position is 1.5 days ahead of schedule, down from 2. The buffer is being slowly, steadily eroded, like a Suffolk sea wall built by a mustard magnate who thought determination could outmanoeuvre the North Sea. Spoiler, it couldn't. But we're still moving. IRL. The Gate Escape. A milestone slipped past unannounced last week, and I can only apologise, both to it and to the tracking spreadsheet, which was presumably sitting there flashing its little numbers at me like a neglected Tamagotchi while I was distracted by a mojito. Somewhere during stage 37, we crossed the 2,000 kilometre mark. By the end of stage 38, we'd casually lobbed another 100 on top, taking the total to somewhere north of 2,100 kilometres. A belated glance at the spreadsheet confirms that roughly 78% of that has been done on foot, with the remaining fifth attributed to spin sessions and indoor biking, which absolutely counts because the spreadsheet says it counts and I'm not reopening that debate with myself. This stage split neatly into 2 wildly different theatres of operation. Our final 3 days in Sharm el-Sheikh and then a return to the pavements and fairways of the northwest of England. A temperature swing of about 10 degrees centigrade, and the small matter of one location involving someone proactively bringing me Long Island iced teas, while the other one involves me standing in my own kitchen making an actual cup of tea, and realising the only person bringing me anything now is the postman, and it's usually a bill. Previous Sharm walks have been functional rather than fulfilling. Back roads, hotel perimeter loops, the pedestrian equivalent of treading water. But the first of the final 3 days broke the pattern. This one had actual destinations, 2 mosques and a church, an afternoon that unlocked the actual sightseeing achievement. First up was Al-Mustafa Mosque, opened in 2007, funded partly by donation, partly by government, and apparently involving 143 palm trees, 85 fruit trees, and 31 toilets, because even divine inspiration requires a plumbing budget. It's Sharm's largest mosque, and by any fair assessment, a genuinely spectacular piece of work. It looks less like a local place of worship, and more like someone decided to casually drop a piece of grand Ottoman architecture into the Sinai. All domes, minarets, and intricate detailing. The sort of place that makes you immediately slow down, lower your voice, and take photos you'll later realise don't come close to doing it justice. A short walk away sits the Heavenly Cathedral, a Coptic Orthodox church completed in 2010 and immediately named one of the 10 most beautiful churches in the world. Not a sentence you hear often, and almost never about a building younger than the early smartphones still lurking in people's kitchen drawers, quietly holding 2011 holiday photos hostage. But the Heavenly Cathedral earns it. Decorated in just 2 years by a crew of 19 artists, its interior is essentially the entire Bible rendered in fresco, mosaic and stained glass across every available surface. Creation, Exodus, Apocalypse, all delivered with such vividness that you stop in the doorway like someone's unplugged your brain. It's astonishing, both in its artistry and the fact it took less time to create than most British councils need to approve a zebra crossing or debate the colour of a bin. Then came the Old Market, or rather, Old Market. As the spoken word doesn't always project the nuance required, I am making hugely ironic air quotes here. We'd envisioned a labyrinthine souk of spice merchants, ancient craft stalls and weathered traders conducting the same commerce their grandfathers conducted in lanes worn smooth by centuries of feet. What we got was a series of pedestrianised streets selling fake Gucci bags, pyramid-shaped fridge magnets and hand-carved statues that still feel warm from the mould. The Old in Old Market is doing heroic lifting for a city that didn't meaningfully exist until the 1980s. If you wander in expecting a scene from an old travelogue, the number of shops advertising genuine copy watches will recalibrate you fairly quickly. The Al-Mustafa Mosque at its centre is genuinely impressive. Its twin 76-metre minarets glowing golden green above the market like a building that accidentally ended up presiding over a gift shop empire and is trying to rise above it. But the bazaar itself is less Indiana Jones, more a slightly pressured stroll through a duty-free that's Egyptian-themed but spiritually Heathrow Terminal 5. A polite no thank you gets you through most of it. The mosque alone makes the detour worthwhile. Departure day usually means a dip in mileage, but with a late evening flight I still managed one last lap around Soho Square and beyond before heading to the airport. Which brings us, inevitably, to Sharm Airport, and its staff, many of whom greet travellers with all the warmth of a malfunctioning ticket barrier. If you've ever been to New York City, you'll know the reputation of its people. Abrupt, direct, occasionally bordering on rude, but in a way that's almost charming once you tune into the rhythm. It's part of the experience. Sharm Airport, by contrast, felt less like brusque efficiency and more like a coordinated effort to ask, both verbally and non-verbally, why are you still here? Which is particularly impressive given that the only thing anyone there is trying to do when checking in and going through 5 levels of security is, in fact, leave. After a week of warmth and hospitality everywhere else, it was a jarring finale. If the tourism ministry is looking for an easy win, it might start with whoever's running the induction training at Sharm Airport and have a quiet word about empathy, assistance and the general facial arrangements of everyone in uniform. And then, home. Pavements, fairways, familiar grey skies. The gentle resumption of routine mileage in conditions where nobody's offering you a cocktail, but also nobody's sighing at you for existing in their country. At least nobody's sneering here. Apart from the golf team, obviously, but that's recreational and mutual, and at least they do it to your face with something approximating affection. The mileage is filed, and the spreadsheet has noted the 2,000 kilometre milestone with its customary mixture of silent approval and immediate expectation of more. Onward. Virtual Insanity Stage 38. Acle to Kirby Kane. Stage 38 begins in that East Anglian borderland where the landscape looks permanently undecided, as if Norfolk and Suffolk had been locked in a centuries-long custody battle over the marshes and neither side wants full responsibility. The roads don't so much run through it as tiptoe across it, like they're afraid of waking something prehistoric. The rivers behave like retired celebrities threatening a comeback tour, and every village looks faintly startled to discover it's still above water. It's a stretch of country where history doesn't unfold so much as accumulate in layers. Roman shorelines that wandered off, medieval waterways that forgot their job descriptions, and churches that seem to have been built for a coastline that never arrived. The map promises simplicity, the terrain responds by laughing in your face. On the straight and narrow. We resume our eastward meanderings at Acle, which is the kind of place that has been strategically important for so long it stopped making a fuss about it. In Roman time, when Great Yarmouth was still just a sandbank and the Broads were a saltwater estuary called Garriensis, Acle sat at its head as a proper trading port. There were ships, there was commerce, there was, presumably, fish. In Saxon days, the shoreline ran through what is now the middle of the village, so some houses today have sandy front gardens and flinty back ones, the geological equivalent of a property that can't decide which century it belongs to. The name means clearing in an oak forest, which is charming until you remember the Tudors levelled a lot to build Elizabeth I's warships. A noble sacrifice, though probably not what the trees had in mind. St Edmund's Church is a round tower number, its base dating to the 9th or 10th century. Solid Saxon masonry that may once have doubled as a lookout over the estuary before the estuary wandered off and reinvented itself as a network of accidental lakes. Local tradition claims the chancel screen was hauled in from St Benet's Abbey, which is still technically alive thanks to a loophole. Not bad for a monastery that's basically a pile of stones and fresh air. Henry VIII tore through monasteries like a Tudor-era malware attack. Glastonbury, Reading, Walsingham, Fountains, Bury St Edmunds, St Albans, all flattened without so much as a buffering wheel. But St Benet's, still standing, relatively speaking, because Norfolk invented an ecclesiastical cheat code. Hand the deeds to the Bishop of Norwich, then have him sail in every summer to hold a service and keep the place consecrated. It's the only monastery Henry VIII never managed to close, not through divine intervention, but because Norfolk solved the Reformation with a loophole and a Broad's day cruise. By the 1830s, the Achill Strait was built, a road so brutally linear it looks like someone dropped a ruler across the marshes and declared the job done. It's dead flat, dead straight, and dead boring, as if the landscape took a vow of monotony. Farmers hated it because it carved through their land like a bureaucrat's pen. Travellers loved it because it shaved a few miles off the slog to Yarmouth. In Norfolk terms, that's the difference between "we'll be there before dark" and "bring a tent." Then the 20th century arrived, and Achill's strategic importance was written in concrete. World War II turned the village into a fortress. Anti-tank ditches gouged into the earth, pillboxes squatting by the roadside, all part of a defensive line designed to stop German forces marching inland. Imagine it. Hitler's tanks rolling up the Achill Strait, only to be confronted by a landscape so dull they'd lose the will to invade and go home for a lie down. Today, Achill is the gateway to the Broads, a description it wears with the calmness of somewhere that's been a gateway to things for 2,000 years and knows gateways are places you pass through, not linger in unless you've broken down. The annual Achill Regatta was founded in 1890 and ran like clockwork until 1937, then vanished for 4 decades. Norfolk didn't cancel it, it just put it in a drawer and forgot. In 1978, 5 blokes in a pub resurrected it, because that's how Norfolk handles heritage, with beer and boats. And in 2024, Great Yarmouth Yacht Club finally remembered it had left the regatta in the glove compartment for 87 years. That's not continuity, that's selective amnesia with sails. For Pete's sake. Slight reprise. We've nodded to the Norfolk Broads before, but let's pause and actually dig into their backstory, because since 2015 they've carried the official badge of Broads National Park, despite being one of England's great accidental landscapes. Internationally significant, ecologically rich, and created almost entirely because medieval monks hacked fuel out of the ground with the long-term foresight of someone microwaving tinfoil. The Broads are basically the Middle Ages answer to "future me can deal with that." The tale starts in the 11th century, when monasteries around Norwich began cutting peat from the marshes east of the city. By the 14th century, Norwich Cathedral Priory alone was burning through 400,000 turfs a year, the medieval equivalent of leaving every light on and assuming divine intervention would pick up the tab. For generations this continued, back-breaking, industrial-scale excavation. Then, in a lesson we should probably tattoo onto the foreheads of anyone in charge today, the climate shifted, sea levels rose, rivers flooded, and the pits filled with water. The medieval fuel industry had accidentally built a system of 63 lakes connected by 7 rivers, more than Venice and Amsterdam combined, and achieved without a single urban planner, just centuries of short-term thinking and a rising tide. For centuries, everyone assumed these were natural features. It wasn't until the 1950s that botanist Joyce Lambert noticed the suspiciously vertical edges of the Broads, took core samples and proved they were flooded peat diggings. J.N. Jennings' 1952 book, which had confidently argued the opposite, was quietly escorted off stage. The Broads remain the only man-made national park in England, not wilderness, but the long, soggy consequence of a medieval energy crisis. Despite their origins, the ecology is extraordinary. The park covers 0.1% of the UK, yet contains more than a quarter of its rarest species. The swallowtail butterfly, Britain's largest, exists here and nowhere else. Bitterns, cranes, otters, and the Norfolk hawker dragonfly thrive in reed beds and fens. The Broads Authority calls it Britain's biodiversity hotspot, which is polite shorthand for this place is doing everyone else's ecological homework. So the Broads aren't a triumph of untouched nature, but of human miscalculation. Monks ran out of timber, dug peat, flooded the pits, and accidentally created a national park. Now, 8 million visitors a year arrive to admire the mistake. And if history is any guide, maybe today's ecological disasters will turn out just as well. Rising seas, collapsing ice sheets, mass extinctions. Give it a few centuries and someone will be selling tickets. Welcome to the Great Barrier Reef Memorial Lagoon, brought to you by ExxonMobil. The Broads prove that human error can occasionally leave behind a paradise. The trouble is, banking on climate catastrophe to deliver a happy accident is like hoping your house fire will redecorate the kitchen. It might, but you're not going to enjoy the process. Sand by me. Just before Great Yarmouth, the A47 finally gives up and veers south, as if even the road has grown tired of trudging relentlessly east and wants to lie down. The town itself began as a sandbank, not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, just a literal heap of wet grit dumped by 3 rivers that couldn't be bothered to carry their silt any further. In Roman times it was open sea, with forts at Caister-on-Sea and Burr Castle staring out at the waves like bored security guards waiting for something to happen. Then the Yare, Bure and Waveney spent centuries pushing silt into the estuary until a narrow spit of land appeared. Fishermen moved in, set up camp, and by the Doomsday Book, about 400 people were clinging to this glorified sandbar like barnacles on a dinghy. The herrings are the key to everything. By the 12th century, Yarmouth hosted the largest herring fair in Europe, pulling in merchants from France, Flanders, Germany and the Hanseatic League. By 1334, the town was so rich it ranked 4th in national tax revenue, behind only York, Bristol and Newcastle. Imagine that, a sandbank out-earning most of England. The town walls, built between 1262 and 1396, still stand, one of the most complete sets in the country. St Nicholas's Church, founded in 1101, is still the largest parish church in the nation. Proof that herrings can bankroll architecture as well as indigestion. Eventually the herrings ran out, which is what happens when you hoover them up for 8 centuries straight. But before they vanished, the boom years had already furnished Yarmouth with a cast of characters. Anna Sewell, born here in 1820, wrote Black Beauty. Sir John Fastolf, born in 1378, fought at Agincourt, built Caister Castle with French ransom money and partly inspired Shakespeare's Falstaff. Daniel Defoe visited, admired the town and opened Robinson Crusoe with a storm off its coast, presumably because nothing says adventure like nearly drowning near Yarmouth. And then in 1952, the same year J.N. Jennings was confidently insisting the Broads were natural, the fish finger was invented at the Bird's Eye factory in Great Yarmouth. The factory still stands near Ness Point, and the fish finger is still with us, unchanged in 70 years, which is more than could be said for the herrings. It's Britain in breadcrumbs, industrial, beige and somehow immortal. The Hippodrome Circus, built in 1903 by George Gilbert, is one of only 2 permanent circus buildings in Britain, and one of just 3 worldwide with a floor that lowers into a swimming pool for water shows. It's a Grade 2-star listed Art Nouveau landmark, bought in 1979 by Peter J, whose family still runs it today. For me though, Great Yarmouth isn't just a list of landmarks, it was one of our regular family holiday haunts in the late 70s. Games on the beach, rides at the pleasure beach, and the hypnotic lure of the amusement arcades remain steadfastly lodged in memory. The pleasure beach itself opened in 1909, and its wooden roller coaster from 1932 is still rattling away. One of only 2 in the UK where the brakeman rides with you. Which sounds heroic until you realise the job description is basically sit next to screaming tourists and yank a lever so they don't die. Imagine being paid to be the human seatbelt on a wooden death trap that's older than your nan's teapot. It's the only ride where the health and safety feature is a bloke in a flat cap. Over the years, the Pleasure Beach grew to 26 rides, including the Joy Wheel and Scenic Railway, becoming the soundtrack of summer for many. Candy floss, arcades, and the eternal hope that this time the coins would actually cascade out of the Twopenny Falls. So Great Yarmouth is a town that began as a sandbank, got rich on herrings, and invented the fish finger. It's a place where history, geography and comedy all meet, sometimes in a circus pool, sometimes in an amusement arcade, and sometimes in the knowledge that your seaside nostalgia is built on centuries of fishing and a tourism economy that rises and falls more dramatically than the Pleasure Beach roller coaster. Half the story. Gorleston-on-Sea sits south of Yarmouth across the River Yare and has spent most of its history in a state of mild administrative identity crisis. Historically Suffolk, parish in Suffolk, spiritually Suffolk, and then, in 1835, quietly hoovered into Norfolk like someone tidying the wrong pile of paperwork. For centuries, Gorleston looked across the river like the sibling who keeps being invited to family events but never actually appears in the group photo. The name appears in the Domesday Book as Gorlestuna, a settlement of 46.5 households, which, in Domesday terms, is basically a metropolis with sheep. The 0.5 is the best part. Nothing says medieval England like a census that confidently lists half a household, as if someone was partway through inventing subletting, or the scribe got bored and wandered off mid-count. Then there's the theory, and we're using that word generously, that the name comes from a druidic stone circle called the Gullstones. 10 standing stones, each 10 feet high, supposedly still standing in a field called Great Stone Close until 1768, when they were removed to build a road. It's a charmingly specific story, and almost certainly nonsense, conjured by W.E. Randall, editor of the short-lived Gorleston and Southtown magazine in 1831, who also forged various historic documents because he was basically the Victorian version of a man editing his own Wikipedia page. Gorleston's Gullstones belong firmly in the folder marked entertaining fiction, alongside the town's other optimistic historical claims and any coastal cafe boasting award-winning ice cream no one can actually trace to an award. The more verifiable history is entertaining though. The Gorleston Psalter, a 14th century manuscript and one of the finest examples of East Anglian art, is famous for the deranged side quests in its margins, hybrid beasts, grotesques, and doodles that suggest the monks were either very bored, very creative, or both. One doodle shows a fox carrying a goose by the neck while the goose says quack, which is magnificent because geese don't quack, they honk, so whatever quack is, it's clearly the sound a goose makes when it's being kidnapped by a fox and linguistically improvised by a monk who's never been within honking distance of an actual goose. Or maybe it was the medieval version of autocomplete, who knows. In more recent news, in 2019, Danny Boyle filmed key scenes from Yesterday, the film in which a struggling musician wakes up in a world where the Beatles never existed, at Gorleston Pier Hotel and Beach. Extras gathered, drones buzzed overhead, and the town briefly existed in a timeline where global pop culture had collapsed, but the ice cream van continued its shift without blinking, because, even in an alternate universe, someone still wants a 99 with a flake. And because Gorleston loves a plot twist, it also has a lighthouse, a cliff garden, and a beach that somehow manages to be both enormous and invisible to half the country. It's a town that delivers surprises at a steady, sustainable pace. Like a coastal subscription service, where every month you receive a new fact you weren't expecting but are quietly pleased about. Pottering about. Hopton-on-Sea has two distinguishing characteristics that sit in unusual proximity. The first is that, like Gorleston, it was once in Suffolk, only becoming part of Norfolk in 1974 when county boundary changes reshuffled the coastal parishes. At that point, the village added on-sea to its name, as if finally embracing the coastline it had been sitting next to for centuries but never quite committed to. And yet, 50 years later, everyone affected still insists they were better off in Suffolk. Proof that you can redraw the map, rename the village, and even give it a coastline, but you can't redraw the mindset. Or the increased council tax bill. The second is that it hosts the World Indoor Bowls Championship every January at Potter's Resort, bringing the BBC, hundreds of spectators, and the entire professional bowl circuit to a small coastal village between Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft. It's either the most unlikely venue for a World Championship, or a perfectly sensible one if you've ever played bowls, a sport that thrives on carpet, concentration, and the faint smell of seaside drizzle. Potter's Resort, formerly Potter's Holiday Camp, established by Herbert Potter in 1920 after winning £500 in a newspaper competition, moved to Hopton in 1924. For me, Potter's is a teenage throwback. It was here that I once played football in a game refereed by Martin Peters, scorer in England's 1966 World Cup final win and capped 67 times, watched members of the public get chucked around a wrestling ring, and finally beat my dad at something. If you've stuck with me through 38 stages of this waffle and remember this from the preface, thank you. although realistically you're either family or someone who owes me money. Hopton is also the northern terminus of the St Mary Michael Pilgrim's Way, which runs from Cornwall to Norfolk and ends here at the North Sea, presumably because there's nowhere further to walk unless you fancy drowning. The village's notable former residents include comedians Eddie Large and Joe Pasquale, and West Ham United captain Mark Noble, which means Hopton has somehow produced both slapstick and midfield grit. So you've got contested county boundaries, professional bowls, extra long mystical hikes, and Joe Pasquale, which is, in its way, the perfect English coastal cocktail. History, sport, and surrealism colliding in a place kids were once coached by a 1966 World Cup hero. Mustard seeds. Continuing south, Corton is the Suffolk village equivalent of someone politely insisting they're fine while the North Sea steadily eats their living room. The Doomsday Book had it down as Carratuna, Viking in origin, and back then it included Newton, a neighbouring settlement now entirely gone, swallowed whole by the sea like a starter course. In the 1870s, Jeremiah James Coleman, yes, the mustard man, threw £70,000 at a sea wall in the hope of persuading the North Sea to behave. The sea, famously unmoved by condiments, carried on regardless. Within 30 years, the wall was crumbling, and by 1917, the cliff-top mansion it was meant to protect was so unsafe its contents had to be sold off before demolition. Corton's history is basically a recurring sketch: human determination, geological indifference, and the inevitable moment where the village sighs and accepts defeat. On the estate there was an area nicknamed the Pit, which sounds like something out of Edgar Allan Poe, but was, disappointingly, just a gravel hole. Its stones once kept Corton's roads passable, a noble civic duty for what was essentially a glorified dent in the ground. By the late 19th century, it had reinvented itself as a sort of municipal playground, rechristened the Town Pit or Cockles Pit, with Jeremiah Coleman installing swings and roundabouts like a benevolent mustard-flavoured Santa trying to distract everyone from the coastal erosion. Naturally, Corton couldn't leave it at that. By 1911, the swings had been replaced by rubbish, and the parish council was lodging complaints about a plague of rats pouring out of the pit like Poe had taken over the parish minutes. By the 1960s, it was less public amenity and more unofficial landfill, a crater of broken furniture and domestic detritus. Eventually, the village gave up, buried the whole mess under soil in 1984 and rebranded it as a children's play area, because nothing says urban renewal like slapping a swing set on top of a rodent graveyard. For 30 years, Corton even had a naturist beach south of the cliffs, designated in 1979, revoked in 2009. 3 decades of sanctioned nudity, undone by bylaw. Proof that even local government eventually gets tired of sand in awkward places. More recently, the parish council doubled down, erecting signs in 2025 declaring Corton Beach is not a naturist beach, and threatening CCTV monitoring of lewd behaviour. Naturists, who've been using the beach regardless, accused officials of the kind of village-scale overreach where the council acts like it's thwarting a coup, when in reality it's just Derek from Ipswich trying to avoid tan lines. Today, Corton has just over 1,000 residents, perched just north of Lowestoft on the Suffolk-Norfolk border. Coastal defences are now described as end of life and failing, with councils debating whether to repair or retreat. Corton is England distilled, quietly fascinating, slightly tragic, and absolutely convinced that if we just build one more wall, this time the sea will listen. Spoiler, it won't. EastEnders. And so we reach Lowestoft, the 4th stop on our tour of Britain's extremes. We've ticked off the northernmost, the highest, and the westernmost, and, for anyone who spent geography lessons drawing on their exercise book, we're now at the eastern edge, the bit of Britain that wakes up first whether it wants to or not. Lowestoft's easternness is its entire personality, the one fact wheeled out like a party trick nobody asked for. It's the first place in Britain to see the sunrise, which sounds poetic until you realise the view is mostly a sewage pumping station and a wind turbine called Gulliver. Stand at Ness Point with your back to the country and the next land you'd hit is the Netherlands, which is why, in the medieval period, it was quicker to sail to Amsterdam than get to London. Some things never change. Ness Point itself is not glamorous. It's Britain's easternmost tip, the literal edge of the map, but in practice it's a concrete apron beside an industrial facility, marked by a Euroscope compass pointing to European cities and dominated by Gulliver, the 126-metre turbine that was Britain's tallest when built in 2005. It's the sort of landmark that should feel profound, but mostly feels like you've accidentally wandered behind the tourist brochure. The town's name comes from the Viking personal name Hlothere, combined with the Old Norse toft, meaning homestead. A Danish settlement planted on the edge of the land they were busy annexing. By the Domesday Book, it was a fishing village of about 20 families. The harbour arrived in 1831, the railway in 1847, and the town expanded rapidly as both a fishing port and seaside resort, proving that nothing delighted Victorians more than the chance to eat fish while flirting with hypothermia. From 1757 to 1802, the Lowestoft porcelain factory churned out soft-paste porcelain decorated with Chinese motifs. Some pieces bore the inscription, "A trifle from Lowestoft," among the earliest branded souvenirs in English history, though crushing if you were expecting custard, sponge and sherry rather than crockery. In 1916, Lowestoft was bombarded by the German Navy during World War I, timed to coincide with the Easter Rising in Ireland. A reminder that being Britain's front door also means being the bit that history kicks first. Today, Lowestoft is trying to reinvent itself. A £24 million cultural quarter is rising on the old Battery Green car park, part of a master plan to drag the town centre into the 21st century with arts, leisure and placemaking. Council speak for, please stop driving straight to Norwich. Offshore wind has poured millions into new bases at the port, making Lowestoft a hub for servicing turbines in the North Sea, which is the nearest thing to a civic glow-up since the Victorians decided sea air cured everything. And then there's the Gullwing Bridge, a £145 million piece of infrastructure designed to connect the town more smoothly across Lake Lothing. It opened in 2023, and locals have already developed a sport of their own, jumping the red lights rather than waiting for the bridge to lift for boats. Because nothing says regeneration like turning your commute into a live-action remake of The Italian Job. It's the kind of detail England specialises in. A geographical absolute, bridge jumpers, a piece of frozen food and a very tall turbine, all crammed into the same postcode, all quietly insisting they're part of a coherent narrative. They're not, but that's Lowestoft, the first place to see the sun, and the last place to pretend any of this makes sense. All peasant and correct. Time for an about turn then. The next stretch of our journey heads significantly westwards and steadily southwards, until we eventually wash up on the Isles of Scilly in 14 stages' time. And so, first to Carlton Colville, which sounds like a backbench MP who only ever asks pointless questions in the Commons about bus timetables, yet somehow manages to smuggle the entire medieval class system into its name. Carlton from Old Norse Carl, free peasant, plus Old English ton, settlement. Colville from the Norman family who owned the manor and stamped their surname on it. Put them together and you get 15 letters of Anglo-Scandinavian peasants paying rent to Norman landlords, a tiny territorial footnote that's outlived the landlords by centuries. Today, Carlton Colville is effectively Lowestoft's overspill, its village character absorbed into the town's southwest edge. But it still has one thing that makes it stand out, the East Anglia Transport Museum. Not just any museum, the only one in Britain where you can ride trams, trolleybuses and a narrow gauge railway on the same site. Its origin story is peak English eccentricity. In 1962, 4 enthusiasts discovered that an old Lowestoft tram, car number 14, built in 1904, had been converted into a summer house in a Gunton garden. They liberated it. And from that act of tram rescue came the museum, a donated meadow in Carlton Colville, buildings in 1966, public opening in 1972, and full tram and trolleybus operations by 1981. It now includes a reconstructed 1930s street scene with shop fronts, post office and authentic street furniture, because no tram should have to spend retirement as a conservatory. The surrounding marshes and reed beds running down to the River Waveney are designated a site of special scientific interest, home to rare water plants like bladderwort and water soldier, and dragonflies so protected they're basically the marshland aristocracy. St Peter's Church, dating back to the 13th century, adds a Gothic footnote. In 1844, the opening of a grave revealed about 30 skeletons lying close together. The sources don't explain it, which is probably for the best. Suffolk already has enough churchyards auditioning for their own true crime podcast. Carlton Colville then, peasants and Normans in the name, trams rescued from summer houses, dragonflies with legal protection, and a churchyard mystery of 30 skeletons. A reminder that in England, even the suburbs come with bonus law. A raft of problems. Barnby and North Cove sit on the River Waveney like two villages in a long-term relationship who refuse to move in together. They share facilities, landscapes and the same stretch of floodplain, but maintain separate parish councils out of sheer principle, the local government equivalent of sleeping in twin beds. Barnby turns up in the Domesday Book as a medium-sized settlement, while North Cove does not, which either means it was part of Worlingham at the time or simply too small for the Normans to bother writing down. North Cove finally appears in its own right in 1204, presumably after a century of drying out and deciding it was tired of being the bit of Worlingham that squelched. Its name almost certainly refers to a creek off the then tidal Waveney, one of many inlets since drained, silted or absorbed into the reclaimed marshland that now forms the Broads. The parish church of St Botolph dates from the 12th century and contains some of the finest medieval wall paintings in East Anglia. 14th century depictions of the Passion and Judgment Day, painted on plaster inside a thatched flint church on the edge of the marshes. It's Grade 1 listed, complete with a 15th century tower, medieval doorways and a roof that looks like it should have a thatcher permanently on retainer. It's also one of the least visited major medieval churches in the region, largely because nobody passes through North Cove on the way to anywhere. Nearby there's Barnby Broad and Marshes, 190 hectares of grazing marsh, carr woodland, fen and open water stretching from the villages to the River Waveney. It's a site of special scientific interest, a special area of conservation, a special protection area and a Ramsar wetland. A stack of designations so long it reads like the marsh has been knighted. The Broad itself was formed by medieval peat cutting and still hosts white water lilies, tussock sedge, marsh arrowgrass and southern marsh orchids, all watched over by the occasional heron pretending to be a lawn ornament. But the real star is the fen raft spider, one of Britain's largest and rarest spiders, reintroduced here by Natural England and the Suffolk Wildlife Trust, partly funded by the BBC Wildlife Fund. This is a creature that can walk on water, hunt on water and dive beneath it when annoyed. It is, in short, a spider that behaves like it has superpowers. Suffolk Wildlife Trust describes it as having been brought back from the brink of extinction through captive breeding and translocation, and they're now thriving in the marshes, presumably because nothing else wants to argue with them. If you're an arachnophobe, honestly don't Google them. They look like someone crossed a tarantula with a speedboat and then gave it the self-confidence of a minor Marvel character. They've got the leg span of a small dessert plate, the colouring of something that should come with a warning label, and the general vibe of an animal that knows full well it can run towards you just as easily as away. They sit on lily pads like they're waiting for a meeting to start, and when they move, it's with the unsettling glide of a creature that has absolutely no business being that fast on water. Which leaves you with the uneasy feeling that while it's wonderful they've been saved from extinction, you're not entirely convinced they should have been put back. There's conservation, and then there's deliberately reintroducing an 8-legged amphibious assassin to a quiet Suffolk marsh and calling it habitat management. It's hard not to admire the effort, but it's equally hard not to look at a spider that can sprint across a pond and think, are we absolutely sure this was the right call? Wall of Duty. Worlingham is one of those Suffolk places that looks perfectly ordinary until you start peeling back the layers, at which point it behaves less like a village and more like a historical lasagna. It turns up in the Domesday Book as Worlingham, the place of the people of Worler, which is helpful only if you know who Worler was, and nobody does. What the record does make clear is that 11th century Worlingham came in two sizes, Magna and Parva, both held by the de Colville family, the same Norman dynasty whose name later attached itself to Carlton Colville down the road. Medieval Suffolk, small world, big families. The smaller half of that pairing, Worlingham Parva, then pulled off one of the great disappearing acts of East Anglian history. It was recorded in 1086 and then essentially ghosted the entire medieval period. Its church, a round tower Saxon building dedicated to St Peter, dating from around 950 AD, was still in use in 1474 and then vanished so completely that it took the construction of the Beccles bypass in 1980 to find it again. The diggers uncovered the church footprint, burials and the remains of a settlement that had been hiding under farmland for half a millennium. Norfolk and Suffolk have layers, and sometimes the layers are churches you only discover when you're trying to build a road. Worlingham Hall is a sort of country house that looks like it should be hosting a Jane Austen adaptation, except half its parkland has been replaced by a bypass and the rest by a housing estate. The original plans were drawn up in 1785 by John Soane, who later designed the Bank of England, before being swapped out for a design by Francis Sandy. The estate once boasted a castle folly, a duck decoy, a dovecote, an icehouse and a pair of entrance lodges, the full Georgian starter pack. A duck decoy, for the uninformed, is one of those Georgian inventions that sounds adorable until you realise it's an industrial-scale duck kidnapping system. It's essentially a picturesque ambush, like Springwatch directed by Quentin Tarantino. In a twist absolutely everybody had on their Georgian estate bingo card, the hall now survives as a wedding venue, surrounded by ornamental trees and the ragged remains of a serpentine garden wall. The long, wavy kind built in curves so it can stand sturdily while using fewer bricks. I still prefer the term crinkle-crankle wall, even though it sounds like something invented by a committee that had run out of nouns and decided to improvise. Part of the former Ella airfield lies within the parish, a reminder that Worlingham once played host to the most easterly airfield in the UK, operational from August 1944. It specialised in air-sea rescue, which is a polite way of saying flying out over the North Sea in weather that would make a trawler nervous. But Ella had formed long before that. In 1943, it was used by de Havilland Mosquitoes of 618 Squadron to practice dropping highball spinning bombs, a derivative of the bouncing bombs used by 617 Dambuster Squadron. Later, the test pilot, Captain Eric Winkle Brown, why he was nicknamed Winkle I'm not sure, but let's politely step over that particular minefield and carry on, recalled visiting the airfield to demonstrate deck landing techniques, during which he casually bumped into Barnes Wallis, designer of the bouncing bomb, as if Worlingham were the natural meeting place for two men who rewrote aviation history. Net worth. Beccles is one of those Suffolk towns that's been quietly important for so long that it's almost embarrassed to mention it. It's been a market town since the Anglo-Saxon period, when King Edwy handed it over to the monks of St Edmundsbury around 960 AD, essentially the 10th century version of awarding someone a franchise and wishing them luck. By Doomsday, the abbot was paying the crown 60,000 herrings a year, which tells you two things. First, that Beccles was a serious river port, and second, that medieval East Anglia was running a fully fish-based economy long before anyone thought to invent money that didn't smell. By the Middle Ages, Beccles ranked third in Suffolk after Ipswich and Bury St Edmunds, a league position it hasn't troubled since, but which it still wears with the quiet swagger of a football club that once made the playoffs in 1382 and has been living off the memory ever since. The town's most famous architectural quirk is the clock on St Michael's Church, which has 3 faces instead of 4. The blank side points towards Norfolk. Local legend insists this was deliberate, Beccles refusing to give Norfolk the time of day, which is almost certainly nonsense, but the kind of nonsense that feels emotionally accurate. The tower itself is a freestanding medieval campanile, begun around 1500 and completed in 1540, and later sold to the Borough Council in 1972 for 1 penny. The sort of bureaucratic dare you lob into the void, only for the void, in the form of Beccles Borough Council, to shrug, sign the paperwork and get back to its tea. Beccles has a habit of attracting notable people without ever making a song and dance about it. Nelson's parents were married at St Michael's in 1749, which is the closest the town gets to claiming naval supremacy. The poet George Crabbe also married there, presumably before writing poems about how bleak everything was. In 1794, the French writer François-René de Chateaubriand lived in Beccles while exiled from revolutionary France, teaching French and falling hopelessly in love with a clergyman's daughter who quite sensibly did not reciprocate, not least because he already had a wife in France. And yet history remembers him not for the heartbreak, nor the exile, nor the literary angst, but for a large, show-offy cut of beef. It's as if the universe looked at his emotional turmoil and thought, yes, but what if he were also a menu item? Bringing home the bacon. To the northwest we roll through Gillingham, the Norfolk one, not the Kentish one with the football club and the dockyard, where the River Waveney draws the county boundary with a kind of quiet authority only a Broadland waterway can muster. It turns up in Doomsday as Kildincham, which sounds like a medieval attempt at spelling Gillingham phonetically while relying on the 12th century equivalent of autocorrect. The parish today is a cluster of former manors and churches, but in the 13th century it was lively enough that in 1291 a Flemish merchant complained that pirates who'd plundered his ship at Dunwich had then sold the goods at Gillingham, proof that the village was once a sufficiently bustling commercial spot to double as a medieval branch of cash converters. Gillingham Hall provides the village's most surprising brush with national history. The estate was founded by Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and the current Jacobean Hall was built by his son Sir Francis Bacon, philosopher, essayist, Lord Chancellor and pioneer of the scientific method, in the early 17th century. Bacon lived here before his political and financial catastrophes caught up with him, and long before his final, more literal catastrophe in 1626, when an experiment in freezing a chicken on Highgate Hill gave him a fatal chill. It remains one of history's stranger exits. The man who tried to drag science out of the Middle Ages, felled not by intrigue or plague, but by attempting to refrigerate poultry in a snowdrift. It lends Gillingham Hall a certain poignancy, a place where Bacon refined his theories, long before one of those theories ambushed him on a hillside and won. Gillingham's most cinematic moment came in 1947, when the marshes between Gillingham and Beccles flooded so severely that people rowed boats through the fields, corn floated at harvest time, and cattle swam down the river as far as Beccles, where they were revived with brandy at the Pickerel Inn. It's difficult to imagine a more Norfolk scene. Livestock emerging from a biblical flood, with the weary expression of creatures who've seen things, accepting brandy with the stoic gratitude of animals for whom this particular Tuesday has been unusually eventful. Something to behold. Kirby Kane, the final settlement of Stage 38, sits in that gentle stretch of country northwest of Beccles, where Norfolk and Suffolk regard each other across the Waveney with the calm tolerance of neighbours who long ago accepted that neither of them is moving. For a place that now presents as a handful of houses, a round tower church, and a road that cuts through the parish like someone dragged a biro across a map, it's been busy for a very long time. The landscape is littered with Mesolithic flints, Bronze Age ring ditches, Iron Age pottery, Roman tiles and Saxon burials. The archaeological equivalent of a guest book showing that people have been passing through for 10,000 years and consistently deciding that Kirby Kane is a perfectly acceptable place to stop and chip a tool. All Saints Church is the village's most visible landmark. A round-towered flint cylinder rising out of the landscape like Norfolk's attempt at a lighthouse for a coastline it never actually got. The earliest bits go back to the Norman period, when the new management arrived, looked at the flat, marshy horizon and apparently thought, give it a century, this'll all be underwater, best build something coastal. Norfolk specialises in these round towers, 124 of them. A building form found almost nowhere else in England, but scattered across this county with the zeal of a region that discovered flint, liked flint, and decided to make every church look like a medieval grain silo auditioning for a maritime role. Inside, the church contains a 14th century font, a Jacobean pulpit, and a brass memorial plaque dated Anno Do MD-MV, which appears to be a valiant but catastrophically unsuccessful attempt at writing 1605. It sits there on the wall like a centuries-old typo, a small but touching reminder that even in the 17th century, someone in Kirby Kane was staring at Roman numerals with the same expression you get when your laptop freezes during a tax return. And then, in 2025, the parish's deep prehistory unexpectedly re-entered the chat. Kirby Kane found itself in the national press when a local man was charged with attempting to sell a Bronze Age gold sun disk to the British Museum, claiming he dug it up in his garden. As if a 3,000-year-old religious artefact had simply been waiting under the dahlias like a lost set of keys. The case involves allegation of stolen treasure, fraudulent provenance, and a selection of gold rings that appear to have been sourced via methods not entirely endorsed by the Portable Antiquities Scheme. It's a sort of plot twist that would appear in a Detectorist Christmas special if Mackenzie Crook ever snapped and wrote a legal thriller. It's heading for trial in 2027, once the legal system has finished assembling the vast administrative scaffolding required to argue about a 3,000-year-old gold coaster. It is, in its way, the perfect Kirby Kane story. A village where Bronze Age material normally emerges as flints and pottery shards, suddenly producing a legal drama about treasure law, provenance, and the perils of claiming that history just pops up while you're doing the weeding. For a place that presents as quiet and self-contained, Kirby Kane has been many things. A prehistoric campsite, a Roman-adjacent settlement, a Saxon burial ground, a Norman parish, a medieval manor, and, briefly, the setting for a Bronze Age courtroom saga. History here doesn't arrive with fanfare. It just keeps happening in the background, leaving behind flints, fonts and the occasional misengraved plaque. The road from Beccles has already crossed accidental lakes and vanished Roman estuaries, the Sandbank that somehow became the medieval herring capital of Europe, the easternmost point of Britain, the beach where Danny Boyle filmed a world in which the Beatles never existed, a village where cattle were revived with brandy like hungover aristocrats, and a market town whose church tells Norfolk the time on only 3 faces, as if the 4th simply couldn't be bothered. It is, like most of this journey, far stranger than the map suggested. The road continues south and west, still pretending it knows where it's going. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.